So what is critical thinking? I had my own definition, but when I started to look more carefully in the research and the literature, I found that there are many different definitions of critical thinking. Each textbook, for example, that I looked at had a different definition, and each educator that I talked to had a different definition. Some of them even said things like, it's whatever you think it is. So what I wanted to do in my research was to find the Socratic definition of critical thinking. That is, I wanted to find what's universal about all these definitions of critical thinking. And some of the definitions were short, a sentence or two. Some were very long because they were listing skills that are involved in critical thinking. So again, I wanted to find what all these had in common. So as I looked through the literature, I found that they all agree that critical thinking is active, not passive. So if you look at Yoda here, he's kind of meditating. He's thinking about his own thinking, and he's observing the patterns by which his thoughts and desires arise in his mind. He's prioritizing his goals and desires. And in general, he's actualizing his potential. And then you have Homer Simpson, who's really looking good here. But he's a passive thinker, by contrast, right? He's acting on his first desire, which is probably for beer. He's passively reacting to his first emotion, which is probably anger at Bart. And he believes that the first idea that pops into his mind is worth pursuing. That is, Homer is not evaluating his thoughts. He's not steering his thought. So the experts agree that critical thinking is more than thinking. It's more than daydreaming. It's actively steering and evaluating your thought so that you can actualize your potential as a thinking human being. Another thing the experts agree on is that critical thinking involves solving problems well. So if you look at this person solving the Rubik's here, there's many ways to solve it, and there are many skills involved. So when you're solving problems, you are seeing from multiple perspectives, you're recognizing patterns, you're testing those patterns, you're exercising impulse control. You might be using trial and error to solve it, or maybe applying an algorithm. Right? Now in this picture next to it, we see a very creative way to solve the problem, right? They just painted it. But painting the cube is arguably not the best solution. It doesn't involve the most critical thinking because you destroyed the purpose of the cube in painting it, and you didn't learn the pattern recognition skills that you could have. Whatever you think of those two pictures, the point is that critical thinkers solve problems well. They have this intellectual toolkit, a set of skills that helps them solve problems well. The third theme that the literature agrees on is that critical thinking is not negative. A lot of students, when they hear the word critical, they think of criticism, tearing down, judging, debating your opponent. But the word critical refers to criteria. It refers to judgment based on criteria, not just tearing down. Even more importantly is to recognize that critical thinking is not just about judgment either. It's not just about judgment based on criteria. It takes a great deal of critical thinking to find common ground, to build, to synthesize, right? To see what's good and true in another person's position, as well as what's bad and false. So again, it's not just negative, and it's not just about judgment. And then finally, the literature, especially recently, is exploring all of the psychological habits and dispositions associated with critical thinking. So if you look at Charlie Brown here, I think he's a good example of a critical thinker. He's willing to question his assumptions and seek help. He's persistent. He's skeptical in that he's willing to suspend his belief until he has enough evidence to form a reasoned belief. He's open-minded in that he will consider all views, but not necessarily accept all views. Right? He's fair and so on. On the other side, you have Cartman from South Park, right? And he's not a very critical thinker. He's in denial a lot, and it's really hard to solve problems if you deny they exist. He's egocentric. He has this idea that mine is better because it's mine. My belief is better because it's mine. He's sociocentric, which is partly the idea that my belief is true because I inherited it from my society. And of course, critical thinkers recognize that that doesn't make it true, and that doesn't make it false either. Right? Rather, you need reasons, not causes, for your belief. In short, when you look at the literature, you'll find dozens of these habits and dispositions being explored. Some promote critical thinking, and some serve as barriers to critical thinking. So when you're learning logic and good thinking, you're also learning these habits. And when you're learning these habits, when you're becoming psychologically healthy, you're also becoming a better thinker, in my opinion. So after looking at these themes and looking at all the definitions and skills involved in critical thinking, here's the Socratic definition that I came up, the attempt to distill the essence of critical thinking. So my definition is critical thinking is the set of intellectual skills and psychological habits that you need to solve problems, discover truths, and clearly communicate. And that's it. The reason there's so many definitions and so on is because there's many ways to solve problems. You could use the scientific method, the persuasive method, the logical method, the Socratic method, right? And so on. There's also many skills that you need to solve problems, discover truths, and clearly communicate. Right? You need to see from multiple perspectives, recognize patterns, produce solutions, judge those solutions, make valid inferences, and so on. And so that's why there are so many definitions and differences in the disciplines. Now, that's my theoretical or Socratic definition, but when I'm teaching or I'm thinking of applying critical thinking, I just turn to good old Bloom's taxonomy. I think it's clear, simple, and concrete, very easy to incorporate into the classroom. And the idea behind Bloom's taxonomy is to not just remember, not just have students remember or memorize information, but have them apply it, analyze it, evaluate it, create it, synthesize it. So for example, I don't want to just ask them on a multiple choice question, what is the Socratic method? That's just testing, recall. Rather, I would have them create a Socratic method dialogue to explore the concept of knowledge after we've read about knowledge in class. Or I would have them defend the importance of the Socratic method. And one reason it's important is because it helps you, gives you a rational way to question authority and gives you a rational way to have confidence in your beliefs. I would also have you compare and contrast the Socratic and the scientific method to better understand the scope of each. So yeah, instead of just memorizing, critical thinking is about creating, defending, comparing, contrasting. And I think comparing and contrasting is one of the best ways. But anyway, by focusing on the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, by focusing on critical thinking, it's more likely that my students will internalize the lessons that you can learn from the Socratic method. And I believe that when you do that with the Socratic method, it'll enrich your life, your personal life, your professional life, all areas of your life, if you can internalize the Socratic method and not just memorize it. So that's what critical thinking is. I've given you a theoretical and an applied definition. Let me quickly go over why I think it's important. I'll just give you 4 reasons. There's more. But the first reason is, as educators, we're required to teach it. So it's a good idea to know what it is and how to do it. A second reason is that whatever you're doing, you'll do it better if you study critical thinking and apply it to what you're doing. So, when you're doing history well and doing science well and doing philosophy well, you're thinking in the logic of those disciplines. You're thinking like historians, scientists, philosophers, and so on. And that's what your teachers want. They don't just want you to, give them regurgitated information. They want you to learn to think in those disciplines. When you're doing that, you're thinking critically, and if you directly study critical thinking, then you should be able to do those things even better. That's my belief, at least. A third reason it's important is because employers say they want it. They want emotionally mature employees who can solve problems, deal with ambiguities, resolve conflicts, clearly communicate. Most of them don't want unthinking robots, right? And so a lot of these employers are starting to give these critical thinking tests, which are kind of like the LSAT and GRE logic portions, But so if we're going to prepare students well, we want to, for these good jobs, we want to make sure we're incorporating critical thinking. And then finally, I think the deepest reason critical thinking is important is not an academic reason at all. It's simply that critical thinking is a key to a flourishing, happy life. If you think about the things that you need to be happy, relationships, self-sufficiency, time for reflection, friendships, all of these things, when you think about them, require critical thinking. And, that's, to explore that would be a whole nother video. But the deepest reason want to teach critical thinking is for that reason. It enriches your life, not just your academic life. So in future videos, I'm going to go over some of the easiest ways to improve your critical thinking. They're not easy, but they're, it takes effort. But if you study logic in both the informal and informal fallacies, this is a great way to improve critical thinking. It's also a great way to improve your score on tests like the GRE, LSAT, and so on, and these employer tests. A good book for that is Irving Kopai's Introduction to Logic, or Patrick Hurley's Introduction to Logic, or just about any introduction to logic. But in future videos, I'll go over the formal and informal fallacies, and much of philosophy is just practicing this critical thinking stuff and improving it. So that's what critical thinking is and why it's important. Thanks.